The first mistake Hannah Lawson made was believing marriage would make her untouchable. She did not realize then that marrying Andrew Lawson did not place her inside his world. It placed her directly in the center of a long-standing war disguised as family loyalty. The union did not offend because it lacked status or elegance. It offended me because it disrupted ownership. Andrew had always been considered a resource before he was considered a son, and Hannah's presence threatened the invisible agreements that governed his life. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. Andrew Lawson's wealth had never been obvious. It lived in authority rather than spectacle, in decisions that shaped industries quietly and permanently. His name carried weight across boardrooms and private institutions, not because it was spoken often, but because it was obeyed. The Lawson family had built their dominance slowly, through inheritance, discipline, and the expectation that every generation would strengthen what the last had protected. Hannah came from none of that. Her life had been shaped by consistency rather than excess, by effort rather than entitlement. She understood responsibility without needing supervision, independence without rebellion. To Andrew, this steadiness felt rare. To his family, it felt dangerous. They could not measure her value using their usual metrics. She did not owe them reverence, and worse, she did not seek it. The announcement of the marriage landed among Andrew's relatives like an act of defiance. It was not discussed openly at first. Instead, it was dissected privately. Records were pulled. Associations were mapped. Her past was scrutinized for leverage that never appeared. Hannah's ordinariness frustrated them. It gave them nothing to discredit, nothing to exploit. What unsettled them most was Andrew's certainty. He did not present the marriage as a request. He presented it as a conclusion. That distinction altered the balance of power immediately. The family had spent years shaping his choices through proximity and expectation. This decision bypassed both. Hannah was not an addition to their world. She was a declaration that Andrew's world no longer revolved around them. The ceremony itself reflected that shift. It was contained, deliberate, and devoid of excess. There was no performance of status, no indulgence in tradition for tradition's sake. Attendance was limited. The focus remained narrow. For the Lawson family, this restraint felt like exclusion. It signaled that the marriage was not meant for them to bless or control. From that day forward, Hannah existed under observation. Every interaction with Andrew's relatives carried an undercurrent of assessment. Their politeness was precise, their distance intentional. She was never openly challenged, only strategically ignored. Invitations were selective, information was filtered, decisions were made around her rather than with her. She was present, but never included. Hannah understood the message clearly. She was tolerated, not welcomed. Andrew, however, refused to allow that tolerance to define their marriage. He adjusted his routines, shifted his priorities, and redrew boundaries that had existed unchallenged for years. The family noticed. They always did. Influence thrives on awareness, and Andrew's growing independence registered as a threat. The estate he shared with Hannah became a symbol of that separation. It was no longer merely an inherited property, but a space reshaped by choice. Hannah approached it cautiously, aware that the walls held more history than warmth. The people within it were efficient but reserved, their loyalty trained upward rather than outward. She learned quickly that comfort was conditional there, and permanence was never assumed. Still, she remained. What the family mistook for patience was resilience. Hannah did not attempt to integrate herself into their hierarchy. She did not negotiate for approval or soften herself to reduce their discomfort. Her refusal to compete for validation unsettled them. It disrupted the dynamics they relied on to maintain dominance. Andrew's relatives began adjusting their strategy. What started as dismissal evolved into preparation. Financial structures were reviewed. Legal frameworks were revisited. Inheritance protocols, long settled, were suddenly of interest again. These changes were subtle, buried beneath legitimate processes, but they signaled intent. The family was no longer waiting for the marriage to fail. They were planning for its consequences. Andrew noticed the shift, but did not confront it directly. He understood his family well enough to recognize that opposition from them rarely arrived openly. It arrived layered in procedure, disguised as protection of legacy. He responded by consolidating control where he could, by distancing himself from dependencies that tied him to shared authority. Hannah remained aware without becoming consumed. She understood that her marriage placed her inside a structure that did not recognize her as equal. She also understood that survival within it required clarity rather than confrontation. She observed, she remembered, she learned. By the end of their first year, the hostility had settled into something colder than resentment. It was no longer emotional, it was strategic. The family no longer questioned whether Hannah belonged. They had decided she did not. The marriage they hated had survived its first test. What no one yet acknowledged was that endurance alone was enough to provoke a reckoning, and the foundation laid in resistance would soon determine who would be left standing when loyalty collapsed into greed. What sustained the marriage was not defiance, but intention. Andrew Lawson did not marry Hannah as an act of rebellion against his family, nor did Hannah remain married to Andrew as an act of endurance. Their bond was formed quietly, without spectacle or dependence on approval. It existed in a space separate from the expectations imposed on Andrew's name and the resistance attached to Hannah's presence. That separation became their refuge. The early years of their marriage settled into a rhythm shaped by mutual awareness rather than performance. Andrew's work required precision, foresight, and emotional restraint. Hannah understood this without needing explanation. She learned when his attention was divided and when it was fully present. She recognized the difference between exhaustion and withdrawal. This sensitivity did not come from submission, but from attentiveness, the kind that grows when two people take responsibility for one another's inner lives. Andrew, in turn, recognized Hannah's independence as strength rather than distance. She did not seek his authority to validate her decisions, nor did she rely on his influence to shape her identity. This balance mattered to him. It freed the marriage from hierarchy. Their partnership did not mirror the power structures Andrew navigated professionally. It functioned on equality, restraint, and trust. The absence of external approval sharpened their bond. Where Andrew's family withheld recognition, Andrew invested more deeply in the life he built with Hannah. Their shared space became intentional. It was not decorated to impress or arranged to reflect legacy. It reflected utility and comfort, shaped around routines rather than appearances. Hannah contributed to these choices not as a guest, but as a co-owner of the life they were forming. Within that shared space, Andrew softened. The man who negotiated with institutions and navigated high-stakes decisions with controlled detachment allowed vulnerability to exist privately. Hannah became the only witness to his doubts, the only person who saw the weight of expectation he carried without trying to reshape him to fit it. She did not frame his burdens as weaknesses. She treated them as realities, neither romanticizing nor dismissing them. This understanding created intimacy that did not rely on grand gestures. Their connection deepened through consistency rather than intensity. Andrew trusted Hannah with information he shared with no one else. He allowed her insight into decisions that shaped his professional world, not to seek validation, but because he valued her perspective. Her questions were direct. Her observations were grounded. She offered clarity without attempting control. The family noticed the shift in Andrew long before they understood its cause. His reliance on Hannah did not manifest as dependence, but it altered his alignment. He no longer sought consensus where it conflicted with his judgment. He began to disengage from legacy obligations that offered obligation without purpose. The family interpreted this recalibration as influence. They blamed Hannah for changes that reflected Andrew's autonomy rather than her intervention. Hannah did not attempt to counter these assumptions. She understood that perception within the family operated independently of truth. Instead, she focused on strengthening what existed between her and Andrew. She supported his decisions without replacing his agency. She maintained her own pursuits without competing with his responsibilities. Their lives intersected without consuming one another. This balance became the foundation the family underestimated. Andrew's relatives expected tension, friction, imbalance. They anticipated moments where Hannah would overreach or withdraw. They waited for evidence that the marriage would compromise Andrew's effectiveness or redirect his priorities in ways that could be framed as instability. That evidence never surfaced. Instead, Andrew became more precise. His decision-making sharpened. His long-term planning reflected permanence rather than contingency. He restructured holdings and interests with a focus on sustainability rather than tradition. These shifts were subtle but unmistakable to those accustomed to reading power through patterns. The family sensed a narrowing of access. Information reached them later. Influence required negotiation rather than assumption. Hannah's role in this evolution remained invisible to them, and that invisibility frustrated their assessments. She did not appear in meetings. She did not issue directives. She did not perform authority. Her influence operated privately through alignment rather than assertion. She shaped Andrew's perspective without shaping his image. Within the marriage, trust extended beyond emotional intimacy. It entered the realm of foresight. Andrew began preparing for contingencies he had previously dismissed. He recognized that his family's interest in his personal life had intensified beyond concern. Their attention now carried strategic undertones. Hannah did not question this awareness. She supported preparation without feeding paranoia. She understood that foresight did not require fear, only clarity. The couple's conversations shifted toward permanence, responsibility, and protection. These discussions were not driven by anxiety, but by intention. Andrew's wealth had always insulated him from immediate consequence. Marriage introduced a different form of accountability. Hannah's presence transformed abstract legacy into lived responsibility. This transformation unsettled the family further. They observed Andrew withdrawing from performative loyalty while deepening personal commitment. The marriage no longer appeared fragile or provisional. It displayed endurance without dependence on reconciliation. Hannah's refusal to engage with the family's power dynamics removed a variable they could manipulate. The foundation of the marriage was not romantic idealism, it was discipline. Andrew and Hannah understood that love without structure could not withstand external pressure. They built routines that anchored them. They cultivated silence where intrusion was likely. They protected their privacy with intention rather than secrecy. This discipline insulated them from interference while reinforcing mutual trust. By the time the family recalibrated their approach, the marriage had matured beyond vulnerability. It no longer required defense. It existed as a closed system, resilient to external destabilization. What the family failed to recognize was that this foundation would outlast Andrew himself. The strength they misread as compliance was preparation. The intimacy they dismissed as distraction was alignment. The quietness they underestimated was control. And when the structure they relied on most collapsed, it would be this foundation, built in opposition and sustained by intention, that would determine whether Hannah Lawson would break or endure. The next shift would arrive without warning. And it would change everything. The shift did not announce itself with warning or ceremony. It arrived quietly, the way irreversible things often do. Andrew Lawson's death did not occur at the height of conflict or during a moment of spectacle. It happened during a period of relative calm, when the marriage had settled into certainty and the resistance surrounding it had grown less visible but more deliberate. That timing mattered. It created confusion before it created grief, uncertainty before it created loss. Hannah was unprepared not because she was naive, but because there had been no visible signs demanding preparation. Andrew had not lived recklessly. His routines were disciplined, his health monitored, his movements calculated. His life was governed by structure, not chance. That made the absence he left behind feel unnatural, as though a fixed element of the world had been removed without explanation. The news reached her through intermediaries, filtered through formality before it reached emotion. Procedures activated immediately, Institutions moved faster than people, notifications were sent, responsibilities shifted, systems adjusted. Andrew's name, once a constant presence, became a reference point in the past tense. Hannah experienced the loss in fragments rather than in full comprehension. The reality resisted cohesion. Andrew's belongings remained where he had left them. His work continued to produce outcomes he would never witness. His absence was not dramatic. It was functional, embedded in routine disruption rather than visible collapse. Grief arrived unevenly. There were moments of sharp clarity, followed by long stretches of numbness. Hannah moved through days as though observing rather than participating. The world did not pause for her adjustment. Administrative demands replaced emotional space. Decisions required confirmation. Signatures were requested. Expectations did not soften in response to loss. Andrew's family re-entered the foreground almost immediately. Their arrival was measured, controlled, and outwardly composed. They did not bring chaos. They brought structure. Their presence filled the vacuum Andrew left behind with efficiency rather than warmth. They positioned themselves as stabilizers, as the natural stewards of what Andrew had built. Their familiarity with systems and processes allowed them to move confidently where Hannah hesitated. At first, Hannah interpreted their involvement as necessity rather than intent. She assumed that shared loss would soften past hostility. That assumption did not survive long. The family's grief, if it existed, expressed itself through control. They began overseeing matters that had never belonged to them directly. Access was reorganized. Information flowed around Hannah instead of through her. Decisions were framed as temporary measures taken for stability. The language used was careful, neutral, and impossible to challenge without appearing unreasonable. Hannah remained physically present, but increasingly irrelevant. Her role shifted without acknowledgement. Where she had once shared Andrew's life as a partner, she now existed as an accessory to his absence. She was consulted selectively, informed partially, and excluded subtly. Each adjustment appeared minor in isolation. Together, they formed a systematic removal. The estate no longer felt like shared space. It began to operate as territory under review. Staff adjusted their behavior accordingly. Interactions grew formal. Familiarity receded. Hannah noticed doors closing that had once remained open. Schedules changed without her input. Her requests required approval where none had been needed before. The shift was not confrontational. It was procedural. Grief made resistance difficult. Hannah's emotional capacity was limited. She struggled to orient herself within a reality that no longer included Andrew's presence as anchor. The routines that had grounded her dissolved. Silence replaced certainty. Her private mourning collided with external expectation, leaving little room for recalibration. Andrew's absence altered the balance of power immediately. Where his authority had once served as a barrier between Hannah and his family, that barrier no longer existed. The family no longer needed to disguise their resentment. They did not express it openly, but their behavior reflected confidence rather than restraint. Their patience, cultivated over years, had reached its reward. Legal frameworks surfaced gradually. Documents were referenced. Structures were mentioned casually. Language surrounding inheritance and stewardship began to circulate. Hannah recognized these discussions as preparatory rather than informational. They were establishing precedent through repetition, shaping perception through familiarity. She attempted to assert her position through presence rather than confrontation. She attended meetings she was invited to. She reviewed information that reached her. She asked questions where clarity was lacking. The responses she received were polite but evasive. Explanations were framed as complexity rather than exclusion. Andrew's death became the justification for consolidation. The family presented themselves as the only entity capable of maintaining continuity. Their experience, their history, their proximity to Andrew's legacy were emphasized. Hannah's role as his spouse was acknowledged formally but deprioritized functionally. Marriage, in their framework, did not equate to authority. The weight of isolation compounded Hannah's grief. Friends who had once deferred to Andrew's presence now hesitated. Associations cooled. Invitations ceased. Support arrived inconsistently. Hannah began to understand that Andrew's influence had shielded her more thoroughly than she had realized. Without it, she stood exposed within a system that had never accepted her. Still, she did not leave. Her attachment to the life she had built with Andrew anchored her. His absence did not erase their shared history. The spaces they had shaped together retained meaning beyond ownership. Hannah remained, navigating grief while attempting to preserve dignity within a structure that no longer recognized her position. The family interpreted her restraint as weakness. They mistook silence for surrender. They mistook grief for incapacity. Their confidence grew as resistance failed to materialize. They prepared to formalize what had already begun informally. Andrew's death did not immediately destroy Hannah's world. It destabilized it quietly, allowing those who had waited longest to move first. The suddenness of his absence created opportunity disguised as order, and within that opportunity, the family's patience transformed into action. What Hannah had not yet realized was that this moment, defined by loss rather than conflict, would become the axis upon which everything else would turn. The marriage had ended. The war had not. The first acts of betrayal were subtle, measured, and executed with the precision of people who understood consequence better than emotion. Andrew Lawson's family did not storm the house or shout claims. They did not accuse Hannah of anything. They moved quietly, as if their actions were administrative necessities rather than deliberate usurpations. Within days of Andrew's death, procedures that had been dormant for decades came alive. Banks requested additional verification, accounts were temporarily frozen, and access to holdings required approval she had never needed before. Each interaction carried the invisible weight of calculation. Nothing overtly illegal was done, but every step was framed in a way that diminished her authority. Hannah noticed first in the small ways. Routine communications that had flowed directly to her were redirected. Staff she had relied on for years became hesitant, polite but distant, answering questions with formalism rather than familiarity. Requests for documents arrived delayed, with notes emphasizing compliance requirements or family oversight. Everything she once took for granted now required justification. The family's presence became a constant shadow. Meetings were arranged ostensibly to guide continuity, but the subtext was unmistakable. Hannah's influence was unwelcome. They appeared concerned, attentive, and helpful, but every action reinforced her peripheral position. They did not ask permission to intervene. They framed their actions as support while gradually erasing her authority. Even her husband's legal documents, which had once guaranteed her security, were questioned. They combed through wills, trusts, and agreements with careful eyes, citing ambiguities as if they had been flaws deliberately overlooked. Every claim was framed as procedural correctness, but the intent was clear: they wanted control. Hannah attempted to respond strategically. She asserted her rights within the limits she could, referencing agreements Andrew had signed, decisions they had made together, and his expressed intentions. Her words were firm, her actions measured, yet she met with resistance veiled as guidance. The family had anticipated this. They had anticipated her loyalty to Andrew and her unwillingness to create conflict with his memory. They exploited it. The betrayal extended beyond financial structures. The family's social network, once neutral, shifted almost immediately. Friends, acquaintances, and associates who had interacted with Hannah at Andrew's side began hesitating. Invitations disappeared. Consultations became indirect. Emails and messages were delayed or rerouted. The community she had known as part of Andrew's world subtly aligned against her, reinforcing her isolation. It was in the quietest moments, the spaces where no one was speaking, that betrayal was most evident. Staff would omit information. Advisors would act cautiously in her presence. The family would convene privately, creating strategies Hannah would later recognize as deliberate marginalization. Each act alone seemed innocuous. Together, they formed a web. Hannah recognized patterns quickly. She had learned to observe in her marriage to read subtext, and to anticipate responses. She understood the family's objective, to reassert dominance and ensure that Andrew's legacy was controlled by blood rather than bond. The realization was not shocking, but it was cold and deliberate. Even the most innocuous gestures became weapons. A delayed call from a lawyer, a carefully worded notice, a casual remark during what appeared to be a supportive meeting, all carried implications. The family's coordination suggested planning and patience. They had observed her for weeks, calculated reactions, and implemented steps that eroded her authority without confrontation. Hannah felt the weight of Andrew's absence acutely in these moments. Where he had once served as buffer, his presence had guaranteed her position. Now, every decision she made could be challenged, every assertion scrutinized. Grief added a layer of vulnerability she could not ignore, yet she did not falter completely. Her awareness of the family's tactics allowed her to navigate their moves cautiously, documenting every interaction, every subtle infringement. The betrayal also carried psychological weight. The family's composure contrasted sharply with the quiet disruption they were causing. They did not raise voices or show malice overtly, but their calculated calm was more isolating than confrontation could ever have been. Hannah understood that control was more effective when hidden under the guise of responsibility. In parallel, she observed shifts in others around her. Staff and advisors who had previously deferred to her instincts now deferred to the family. Decisions she had taken for granted became subject to delay or review. The systems she relied on had been co-opted, and she realized she was being repositioned from a partner to a bystander. Even in this, she remained deliberate. Hannah did not react emotionally, nor did she confront publicly. She observed, recorded, and internalized. Each act of betrayal added information she could use later. Each encroachment revealed patterns in the family's methods. She understood that survival required strategy and patience, not immediate opposition. The first stage of the betrayal concluded not with a dramatic confrontation, but with subtle shifts that left Hannah stripped of power without being stripped of appearance. Authority was now symbolic. Reality had moved elsewhere. Andrew's family had begun the process of taking control, not through force, but through calculated, patient, relentless strategy. And in this stage, Hannah understood the depth of the challenge she would face. She had survived resistance before, but this was not abstract conflict. It was personal, targeted, and sustained. The family had made it clear her presence alone was unacceptable unless she accepted their control. The battle lines were drawn quietly, invisibly, and effectively. Andrew's death had not ended his influence. It had merely shifted it to those who would use it against the one person he had chosen above all. Hannah's next steps would require careful observation, patience, and a strategy of her own. The betrayal had begun, and its consequences would unfold over time, leaving no margin for error. The changes were no longer subtle. The family moved beyond quiet influence into overt reclamation. Where once Hannah had navigated passive resistance, now she encountered direct exclusion. Her access to Andrew's estate, to decisions, and to the remnants of their shared life was curtailed systematically. Rooms she had once entered freely were suddenly restricted. Staff who had treated her with familiarity now operated with distance, their loyalty redirected to the family. Instructions came through intermediaries. Nothing in the space she had called home remained entirely hers. Every step she took reminded her that the authority she once held was being removed piece by piece. Financial controls followed swiftly. Accounts that had been joint or accessible through Andrew's authorization were frozen or reassigned. Funds she had assumed under her stewardship were now managed under the family's supervision. Explanations were delivered in careful language. This is temporary, it is procedural, we are ensuring continuity. Each phrase disguised intention, but the effect was clear. She had no control. Hannah's attempts to assert presence were met with passive compliance that disguised obstruction. Every question she asked required justification. Every request was rerouted for approval. Decisions that had once been collaborative were made without her input. The world she had shared with Andrew became a theater in which she could observe but not influence. Even her relationships with those closest to Andrew began to shift. Friends, associates, and staff who had once responded to her guidance now deferred to the family. She discovered that loyalty in Andrew's world was often transactional, tied to proximity to influence rather than personal connection. Her presence mattered less than she had assumed, and that reality cut deeper than any financial deprivation. Isolation followed naturally. Hannah found herself increasingly alone in spaces that had once been shared. The family's intrusion was constant, but they maintained an appearance of propriety, leaving her with few avenues to resist. Every move she made required caution, every expression of opinion was scrutinized for signs of overreach. The stripping extended to symbols of personal life as well. Access to Andrew's personal records, private collections, and previously shared projects was curtailed. Items that had represented their shared experiences were catalogued, reassigned, or monitored. The space around her became not a home, but a stage controlled by observers. Hannah's own movements became constrained. Decisions that had been routine now required oversight. Invitations she might have extended were redirected. The family's strategy relied on subtlety rather than confrontation, eroding authority without creating obvious confrontation. Each removed privilege reinforced the message. Her position was temporary, conditional, and fragile. Even as she navigated grief, Hannah recognized the efficiency of their operation. This was not chaos. This was strategy. The family had long memories and patience. They moved according to plan, using the tools of procedure, law, and influence to restructure the world Andrew had built so that it would exist without her. In these moments, Hannah's awareness became her anchor. She documented every interaction, every denial, every procedural adjustment. She noted the pattern of exclusion and the methods by which it was enacted. Though stripped of authority, she was not stripped of perception. Each act of removal carried information she would later use. The psychological weight was immense. The estate, once a space of security, became a constant reminder of absence and control. The familiar staff and associates now functioned as extensions of Andrew's family rather than allies. The routines that had offered comfort now reinforced displacement. Isolation compounded grief, and grief compounded awareness. Yet Hannah endured. She moved through the spaces with measured steps, observing, recording, and internalizing. Every instruction, every restriction, every redirection became a data point. She understood that the family had underestimated her not because she lacked influence, but because they assumed surrender in the face of emotional pressure. Andrew's absence had created opportunity, and the family exploited it with precision. They removed her from authority, from access, and from influence in a manner that seemed justified to outsiders. Within the estate, Hannah was no longer the partner she had been, no longer the figure Andrew had relied upon. She had become a guest in her own life. Even as they stripped her of position and power, Hannah's focus did not waver entirely. She understood that the actions taken against her were deliberate, predictable, and structured. Each step the family took to assert dominance revealed patterns in behavior, providing insight into the priorities they valued and the weaknesses they presumed she possessed. The first days of exclusion left her shocked, but not defeated. The cumulative effect of removal and restriction created a quiet urgency. Hannah realized that passive endurance would no longer suffice. Observation, careful assessment, and strategic planning would be required. She had been cast out from the structures she had relied upon, but she had not been cast out from knowledge, memory, or awareness. The stripping of authority extended beyond property or finance. It aimed to redefine her reality, to create dependence where there had once been partnership. Every measure was precise. Every restriction was intentional. The family operated with the understanding that power once lost was difficult to reclaim. Hannah understood the stakes. She had inherited grief, displacement, and exclusion, but she retained perception. The process that had removed her authority also provided a roadmap for resistance. Every procedural adjustment, every subtle control, every isolation was a clue. In the quiet moments, away from observation, she reflected on what remained untouched: Andrew's intentions, his careful records, the truths only he had controlled. That knowledge became her foundation for endurance. While stripped of immediate power, she had access to memory, information, and strategy. The family believed they had achieved supremacy. Hannah had been removed from influence and authority, and they assumed the marriage that had frustrated them had ended definitively with Andrew's death. They underestimated her capacity for strategy, patience, and awareness. And in that underestimation, the seeds of her future reclaiming were quietly planted. Isolation deepened, not only externally but internally. Hannah Lawson's world had contracted to the dimensions of grief and displacement. The estate, once a shared life with Andrew, now operated as a space defined by absence and exclusion. Staff, advisors, and acquaintances aligned with the family, and the routines that had sustained her marriage no longer functioned as refuge. Each day brought procedural reminders of her diminished authority. Each moment highlighted the gap between presence and power. Grief did not arrive as a single wave. It arrived in fragments. She experienced moments of sharp, piercing clarity, followed by extended periods of numbness. Meals went untasted, sleep arrived in short bursts, and her mind oscillated between recollection and analysis. Every memory of Andrew was now tinged with the weight of loss. Each corner of the estate, each object, each shared routine recalled him with a precision that was almost cruel in its constancy. In this vacuum, she recognized the scope of the family's influence. Their subtle exclusion was reinforced by legal channels, social perception, and financial maneuvering. Where Andrew had been present, he had served as a stabilizing force, a shield, a barrier between her and the systemic pressure exerted by his relatives. His absence transformed protective structures into instruments of displacement. Hannah realized she was facing the cumulative effects of decades-long power consolidation. Even her closest associates exhibited hesitation. Friends who had relied on Andrew's presence for guidance now deferred automatically to his family. Invitations ceased, counsel was delayed, and those who once sought her insight now waited for the family's interpretation. Loyalty, she observed, was often conditional, measured not by personal bonds, but by alignment with perceived power. This realization weighed heavily, eroding the sense of safety she had assumed existed outside of Andrew's influence. Financial uncertainty compounded the emotional strain. Assets she had considered under her stewardship were inaccessible or monitored. Explanations were couched in procedural language, always presenting delays and limitations as necessary for stability. Each restriction, while seemingly mundane, carried the implicit message that she had lost authority over the life she had built with Andrew. Hannah's social isolation was equally profound. Public appearances she once controlled were now filtered or orchestrated by the family. Networks she had accessed through Andrew were subtly realigned to exclude her input. Every interaction reminded her that she was now peripheral to a system in which she had once played a central role. The subtlety of the exclusion made it more disorienting than overt confrontation ever could have been. Psychologically, the erosion of control imposed a constant weight. She experienced fatigue that extended beyond the physical, seeping into decision-making and perception. The isolation amplified grief, and grief intensified the sense of vulnerability. The family's patient, methodical strategy functioned not only to remove her authority, but to reinforce the psychological consequences of loss. Hannah confronted this reality with reflection rather than rebellion. She catalogued interactions, recorded procedural obstructions, and identified patterns in the family's actions. Each act of control, each restriction, each slight revealed assumptions the family held about her responses, priorities, and endurance. Their methodical approach became a blueprint for observation, providing her with information that would become crucial later. During these weeks, she confronted the internal dimensions of her vulnerability. Doubt became frequent, questions of self-worth surfaced, and the desire for retreat was persistent. The low point was not defined by a single failure or confrontation, but by the relentless accumulation of constraints, the quiet erosion of influence, and the psychological toll of being continuously underestimated. In parallel, Hannah reflected on Andrew's guidance, both explicit and implicit. He had built a structure that relied on foresight, documentation, and foresight, much of it invisible until now. While she had been excluded, she retained access to elements that had not been compromised: his intentions, private records, and legal documents he had carefully maintained. These remnants of Andrew's foresight offered a glimmer of strategy amid despair. The contrast between perceived weakness and retained potential became central to her endurance. She recognized that while the family believed their efforts had removed her from the center of influence, they had failed to account for her observation, her patience, and her capacity for strategic action. This understanding became her anchor amid dislocation and grief. Even as she endured social isolation, financial restriction, and emotional exhaustion, Hannah began to cultivate the mental and logistical framework that would allow her to respond. Observation replaced confrontation. Documentation replaced immediate action. Patience replaced reaction. The family's methodical stripping of authority, while devastating, revealed patterns that could later be leveraged for reclamation. The lowest point was not merely physical or social, it was existential. Hannah recognized the depth of isolation, the fragility of assumed loyalty, and the capacity of structured power to erase presence. And yet, within that recognition, she also identified the resources that had been left untouched: Andrew's guidance, her own resilience, and the clarity born of observation. The weeks in this state established both the challenge and the path forward. Hannah was removed, excluded, and psychologically pressured. She faced the cumulative effect of grief, displacement, and subtle manipulation. But the very structure the family had imposed created the conditions necessary for her eventual understanding, planning, and response. She had reached the point where endurance alone would not suffice. Awareness had to transform into strategy. Observation had to become preparation. Grief had to coexist with foresight. The family had assumed that isolation would produce compliance. They had underestimated her capacity to convert constraint into knowledge. By the end of this period, Hannah Lawson understood one immutable truth: survival required patience, intelligence, and meticulous preparation. Every slight, every restriction, every procedural manipulation was an element of a larger puzzle. And while the family believed they had stripped her of power, she retained insight, patience, and access to the evidence that would eventually shift the balance entirely. Her lowest point was not the end, it was the foundation for a methodical response. In the midst of exclusion and isolation, a subtle shift occurred, one that would change the trajectory of everything Hannah had lost. The family had acted with precision, confident that every measure taken after Andrew's death secured their control. Yet within their calculations, they had overlooked a critical element: Andrew's foresight, recorded and preserved in ways invisible to anyone but Hannah. The discovery was neither accidental nor dramatic. It emerged quietly, through her patient review of Andrew's personal files, correspondence, and meticulously maintained records. Each document, each note, each digital file carried layers of detail that Andrew had intended for circumstances exactly like these, circumstances where authority would be contested, where inheritance would be challenged, and where Hannah's position would be undermined by those who assumed they could seize control. The evidence itself was straightforward yet irrefutable. It documented decisions, allocations, and personal intentions in Andrew's own hand and through formal legal channels he had arranged over time. The family had assumed that his death removed both influence and clarity, leaving gaps to exploit. They had ignored the meticulous structure Andrew had established, the one record of truth that could override their procedural obstructions. Hannah's realization did not bring immediate triumph. Instead, it brought clarity. For weeks, she had endured procedural exclusion, subtle manipulations, and psychological pressure. The family's quiet control had seemed unassailable, but the moment she recognized the existence of this evidence, the imbalance shifted. Authority could be restored, not through confrontation or emotional appeal, but through proof. The documents confirmed Andrew's intentions explicitly. They outlined her rights, delineated her authority, and anticipated the very scenarios the family was now exploiting. Each page was a calculated reinforcement of what had been his personal and legal commitment. Where ambiguity had existed in the family's assumptions, Andrew's foresight eliminated it. The evidence did not rely on persuasion, it relied on the permanence of recorded truth. Equally important, the evidence revealed aspects of the family's maneuvering that Hannah could now challenge. Patterns of obstruction, procedural manipulation, and exclusion were documented implicitly, leaving a trail of inconsistency. The family's attempts to consolidate power became visible when juxtaposed against Andrew's clearly defined intentions. Where they had assumed control, they had exposed themselves to scrutiny. Hannah approached the evidence with meticulous care. She catalogued each item, analyzed the implications, and formulated a plan that would transform passive knowledge into actionable leverage. This was not an impulsive reaction. It was deliberate, structured, and informed by months of observation. The evidence did not merely validate her rights, it provided the tools to reclaim them strategically. The process of assembling and understanding the evidence reinforced her awareness of Andrew's foresight. He had anticipated both internal and external challenges, including resistance from his own family. Each directive, each legal arrangement, and each personal note was designed to secure her position should adversity arise. The care he had taken now became her resource. Hannah also recognized the psychological advantage this knowledge provided. The family's confidence rested on her perceived incapacity and isolation. The discovery of Andrew's proof shifted the balance. Where they assumed obedience, she now held undeniable authority. Where they had acted with impunity, she could act with legitimacy. Their strategy, which relied on subtlety and patience, was now subject to exposure. She did not act immediately. The nature of the evidence required discretion. Any premature confrontation would alert the family to the depth of her knowledge and provoke defensive countermoves. Instead, Hannah observed, continued documentation, and waited for the optimal moment to leverage what she had found. Every interaction, every communication, and every procedural adjustment became an opportunity to test the family's assumptions. The discovery of evidence did more than restore a sense of control, it restored agency. Hannah realized that her influence, though previously curtailed, could now be exercised with legal and factual authority. The family's long-standing expectation that she would be passive in the face of exclusion was now contradicted by tangible proof of her entitlement. At the same time, the evidence illuminated the extent of betrayal she had endured. Where exclusion had been subtle, documentation made it undeniable. The careful orchestration of obstruction, previously invisible, became apparent in contrast to Andrew's intentions. Each act of marginalization could now be confronted with clarity, removing the ambiguity the family had relied upon to justify their actions. Hannah's understanding of the evidence extended beyond financial or legal claims. It revealed Andrew's trust in her, his recognition of her capability, and his intent to protect her from the very forces that had begun to erase her authority. In that realization, she found both emotional fortitude and strategic direction. Andrew's foresight was a guide, a shield, and a weapon simultaneously. Preparation became the next step. With the evidence in hand, Hannah began to structure her approach. She organized documents, verified records, and cross-referenced communications to ensure a complete, undeniable chain of proof. She recognized that timing, precision, and control of information would be critical in translating documentation into regained authority. Months of careful observation, endurance, and strategic patience had now converged into opportunity. The evidence provided the key, but the application required meticulous planning. Hannah was no longer passive. She understood the family's methods, their expectations, and their vulnerabilities. The betrayal that had stripped her of influence could now be countered systematically. By the end of this stage, Hannah Lawson held not only the proof of her entitlement, but also the insight to leverage it effectively. The marriage that the family had sought to undermine through absence, exclusion, and subtle manipulation could now be reinforced legally and strategically. The next step was clear: the counterattack. Hannah Lawson no longer operated from reaction, she operated from strategy. The evidence Andrew had left her was now a tool, a blueprint, and a weapon all at once. After months of observation, isolation, and careful documentation, she had mapped the family's tactics, identified their assumptions, and understood their vulnerabilities. The time for patience had ended. The time for action had arrived. Her first step was precision. Hannah approached each claim, restriction, and procedural obstruction with evidence in hand. Legal documents were presented with clarity, Digital records were referenced meticulously, and Andrew's intentions were articulated without embellishment. Every move dismantled the subtle manipulations the family had executed. Where they had assumed ambiguity could shield their actions, she presented incontrovertible proof. The family's initial reaction was disbelief. They had acted with confidence, believing her grief and isolation would ensure compliance. They had relied on her presumed vulnerability and assumed she lacked the tools to challenge them effectively. They had misjudged her capacity for observation, patience, and strategic action. The documents forced them to confront a reality they had not anticipated. Hannah Lawson held Andrew's authority and had the knowledge to wield it. Hannah did not rush. She introduced her countermeasures incrementally. Each intervention was calculated to test the family's responses and to reinforce her position. Staff, advisors, and intermediaries who had deferred to the family were engaged with her guidance, gradually re-establishing channels of authority that had been stripped from her. Each small victory reinforced her leverage. In parallel, she exposed procedural overreach. Where the family had acted under the guise of legitimacy, Hannah demonstrated inconsistencies and violations, carefully highlighting the contrast between Andrew's clear instructions and the family's manipulations. Every subtle obstruction was rendered transparent. The very system they had used to marginalize her became the mechanism for her counterattack. Hannah's approach was not emotional, it was strategic. She did not confront the family with anger or accusation. She presented evidence, followed legal frameworks, and allowed the clarity of truth to operate independently of sentiment. This calm, methodical approach unsettled them further. Their confidence, based on the assumption of her emotional compromise, faltered. Each act of documentation and assertion stripped away the appearance of control they had cultivated. Simultaneously, she cultivated alliances. Associates, staff, and advisors who had been neutral or passive in her marginalization began to align with her as the legitimacy of her claims became evident. Her influence, previously invisible and undermined, began to reassert itself. The counterattack was not solely about confrontation. It was about restructuring the ecosystem in her favor, reclaiming authority across every sphere the family had tried to dominate. The family attempted resistance. Minor disputes, challenges to interpretation, and procedural delays were introduced, but Hannah anticipated them. Her knowledge of Andrew's intentions and her careful documentation rendered most of these attempts ineffective. Each resistance was neutralized with precision, revealing the miscalculations of those who had assumed dominance. The psychological dimension of the counterattack was equally potent. The family had relied on her perceived helplessness to reinforce their strategy. Hannah's calm, measured, and authoritative execution of her plan disrupted their assumptions. Where they expected acquiescence, they encountered deliberate action. Where they anticipated hesitation, they observed precision. Authority, once stripped, was being methodically restored. This stage also involved control of narrative. The family had leveraged perception, subtly influencing associates and external contacts to reinforce her marginalization. Hannah addressed this by presenting the evidence and framing communications in a manner that highlighted transparency, legality, and Andrew's intentions. Slowly, perception shifted. Allies were informed, observers were clarified, and the legitimacy of her claims became undeniable. By the midpoint of her counterattack, Hannah had not only restored access to Andrew's estate and assets, but had begun reclaiming decision-making authority in ways the family could not challenge effectively. Their attempts to assert influence were increasingly ineffective, and their confidence eroded under the weight of her methodical, evidence-backed strategy. The family's earlier patience, which had functioned as a weapon against her, now became a liability. Each previous delay, each subtle maneuver, each instance of exclusion was documented and could be referenced in her ongoing actions. Their attempts at control were now constrained by their own prior steps, and Hannah leveraged this strategically. Hannah's counterattack was comprehensive. It was not about vengeance, it was about restoration and justice. She reasserted her position in financial, legal, social, and operational dimensions. Authority returned not through force, but through clarity, strategy, and evidence. Every move she made highlighted the contrast between manipulation and legitimacy. By the conclusion of this phase, Hannah had transformed from a displaced widow into a force of structured authority. The family, which had once assumed dominance, was now forced into defensive positions. Their previous advantages were neutralized by meticulous preparation, understanding, and execution. The counterattack was complete, but its impact would resonate further. It set the stage for public acknowledgement, the exposure of past betrayal, and the eventual restitution of everything that had been taken. Hannah Lawson had not only reclaimed what was hers, but had demonstrated that strategy, patience, and insight could overcome calculated exclusion. The foundations were laid for the ultimate revelation, the public humiliation and justice that would follow. The shift from private strategy to public assertion was deliberate. Hannah Lawson had reclaimed control internally, but the family's influence extended beyond the walls of the estate into social networks, professional alliances, and public perception. The final stage required exposing the manipulation, asserting her authority visibly, and ensuring accountability for the betrayal she had endured. Hannah orchestrated the exposure methodically. She presented the evidence of Andrew's intentions to legal authorities, advisors, and external institutions involved in the estate. The clarity of documentation left no room for dispute. Andrew's directives, once overlooked or misinterpreted by the family, were now publicly verified. Their attempts to control outcomes through omission or influence were rendered ineffective. The family's public facade began to crumble. Where they had maintained calm, measured appearances, they were now confronted with undeniable truth. Their prior maneuvers, subtle obstructions, procedural delays, and exclusionary tactics were documented and verifiable. External observers, previously influenced by the family's assumed authority, recognized the legitimacy of Hannah's claims and the impropriety of the family's earlier actions. Media, legal institutions, and social networks responded to her evidence with immediacy. The narrative of exclusion and marginalization shifted to one of betrayal by those who had sought to manipulate legacy. Hannah's composed, deliberate approach contrasted sharply with the family's defensive, reactive posture. Their credibility eroded under scrutiny, revealing the depth of planning and deceit that had characterized their prior actions. Public humiliation was precise rather than performative. The family's attempts to assert dominance, once unnoticed, were now exposed alongside Andrew's clear instructions. Advisors and institutions who had previously deferred to the family now acknowledged Hannah's authority and the legality of her claims. Each interaction reinforced the reality that the family had acted against the rightful intentions of Andrew Lawson. Hannah ensured the exposure was controlled. She presented evidence strategically, highlighting procedural violations without unnecessary dramatization. Her approach emphasized clarity, legality, and Andrew's foresight, leaving no room for interpretation or evasion. The result was undeniable. The family's actions were laid bare, and the legitimacy of Hannah's position was reaffirmed publicly. Consequences followed swiftly. Financial accounts were restored under her control, decision-making authority was formalized, and social networks realigned to acknowledge her restored position. Institutions recognized her as the rightful steward of Andrew's legacy. Where the family had assumed that subtlety and patience would secure dominance, they now faced public acknowledgement of their overreach. The psychological impact on the family was profound. Their confidence, built on assumptions of her vulnerability, collapsed under exposure. Their subtle manipulations, once effective, were now documented evidence of intentional obstruction. Each attempt at influence, delay, or exclusion became a record of accountability. Humiliation was not public mockery, but the unavoidable recognition of failure, the exposure of strategy that had been built on underestimating Hannah's capacity for patience, observation, and action. Hannah's own position was reinforced beyond legal authority. Public perception, social influence, and professional recognition all aligned with her restored status. Where she had been marginalized, she now commanded respect. Where the family had assumed control, she had established unchallengeable legitimacy. The counterbalance created by Andrew's foresight and her strategic patience had transformed vulnerability into dominance. The justice of this moment was multifaceted. It was legal, ensuring the restoration of assets and authority. It was social, realigning perception and influence. And it was personal, validating the endurance, insight, and foresight that had guided Hannah through months of isolation, grief, and calculated marginalization. Every act of betrayal the family had executed was now visible, accountable, and addressed. Hannah did not seek vengeance. She did not amplify humiliation unnecessarily. Her goal was restoration and accountability. The family, confronted with public acknowledgement of their actions, had no recourse. Their prior patience, manipulations, and assumed advantage were neutralized entirely by clarity, documentation, and strategic execution. By the conclusion of this stage, Hannah Lawson had not only reclaimed her rightful position, but had established an unassailable precedent. Her authority, grounded in Andrew's foresight and her own strategic patience, could not be challenged through manipulation or exclusion. The family's influence, once formidable, was rendered secondary to truth, legality, and public perception. The exposure and justice achieved in this act paved the way for the final stage. The reclamation of her life, unbound by betrayal, fully restored in authority, influence, and personal sovereignty. The final stage was not a dramatic flourish, but a quiet, complete restoration. Hannah Lawson had navigated grief, exclusion, betrayal, and isolation, emerging not only unbroken but strategically empowered. Her authority, once stripped away, had been restored. Her voice, once diminished, now commanded recognition across every sphere where Andrew's influence had once been leveraged. Hannah moved through the estate with a confidence born of awareness and action. Every decision, every interaction, every process now reflected her agency. Staff and advisors aligned naturally with her authority, not through fear or obligation, but because legitimacy had been restored. The estate operated as a reflection of her vision, informed by Andrew's foresight, but guided by her judgment. Her social sphere transformed as well. Friends, associates, and networks that had hesitated now acknowledged her rightful position. Those who had deferred to the family's influence adjusted their interactions to recognize her authority. Where once she had been isolated, she now engaged as a central figure in decision-making and social influence. Every relationship reflected balance, respect, and recognition of her restored status. Financial independence and control were unequivocal. The accounts, holdings, and assets previously monitored or restricted were now fully under her stewardship. Decisions that had been delayed or overridden were now executed with clarity and efficiency. Hannah's strategic patience ensured not only restoration, but also protection against future attempts at exclusion or manipulation. Beyond authority and material restoration, Hannah reclaimed her sense of self. The months of grief, observation, and strategic preparation had strengthened her awareness, resilience, and judgment. Where once her confidence had been challenged, it now stood firm. Her life was no longer defined by absence or betrayal, but by foresight, patience, and decisive action. The family's role shifted permanently. Their previous attempts at manipulation, obstruction, and exclusion were neutralized publicly, legally, and socially. They were no longer a shadow looming over her life. Their influence was contained, recognized, and constrained by the clarity of truth. The balance of power had been decisively restored. Hannah's reclamation extended to memory and legacy. Andrew's contributions, intentions, and foresight were honored, integrated seamlessly into her management of the estate and personal life. Their shared vision, once threatened by betrayal, now guided operations, relationships, and strategic decisions. The continuity of legacy was no longer vulnerable to manipulation. It was reinforced through clarity, documentation, and authority. She also recognized the personal dimension of reclamation. Grief had transformed into insight, isolation into strategic observation, and betrayal into the foundation for resilience. Hannah Lawson had not only reclaimed what was hers materially, but had reconstructed her emotional and intellectual autonomy. Her life was now hers in full measure, informed by past experience, but no longer constrained by it. With authority, legitimacy, and influence restored, Hannah's daily life returned to a rhythm defined not by exclusion, but by proactive engagement. Every decision carried intention, every action reflected foresight, and every interaction reinforced her autonomy. The estate, networks, and professional relationships now operated as extensions of her restored agency. The culmination of her journey was subtle yet profound. There was no ostentatious display, no dramatic confrontation. The reclamation was complete because it was grounded in preparation, strategy, and unassailable truth. The family's previous control, the months of subtle exclusion, and the manipulations intended to erode her authority were rendered irrelevant in the face of clarity, legality, and foresight. Hannah Lawson's restored life was a testament to endurance, intelligence, and strategic action. She had navigated loss, betrayal, and exclusion, emerging not as a reactive figure, but as one whose authority and influence were reinforced, undeniable, and fully realized. In reclaiming her life, she also reclaimed the narrative. The story of exclusion, manipulation, and betrayal was now one of empowerment, strategic patience, and the restoration of rightful authority. Every moment of hardship had contributed to her capacity for decisive action and unwavering clarity. As the estate, networks, and social perception aligned with her authority, Hannah Lawson understood that she was no longer merely surviving. She was thriving, restored, and fully autonomous. Her life was hers to define, guided by insight, foresight, and the legacy of a partnership that had prepared her to endure even in absence. Where once betrayal had threatened to erase her presence, it now highlighted her strength. Where once grief had narrowed her world, it now reinforced clarity and judgment. Where once isolation had created vulnerability, it now revealed resilience and strategic power. Hannah Lawson had reclaimed everything: her authority, her influence, her autonomy, and her life. The marriage that had been challenged, the betrayal that had been calculated, and the exclusion that had been imposed were all met with patient observation, meticulous strategy, and undeniable proof. The world she once thought diminished her was now realigned entirely under her stewardship, strengthened by clarity, foresight, and unwavering resolve. She moved forward not with vengeance, but with empowerment. The lessons of betrayal, grief, and marginalization were integrated into her understanding, guiding her decisions, interactions, and life with precision and foresight. Hannah Lawson's reclamation was complete.